Welcome to the Bare Essentials Podcast, where the talk is real and hibernating on your goals is not an option.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Charles Wallace. Today's guest is the author of the Get Out of Your Head book series, a collection of personal development works focused on helping readers overcome various forms of mental illness. The first entry in that series, Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, was released in 2018. He also runs a website and blog of the same name, www.getoutofyourhead.com. Through his site, he offers written advice and coaching to clients looking to make strides in their battles with mental illness. His desire to help others with anxiety and depression grew out of his own experiences with the afflictions. Throughout his works, he recounts his past struggles with them due to not having the right information at his disposal. That's why he's so passionate about using his skills to influence the lives of others. He wants to help as many people as possible avoid such a fate. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Brian Sachetta. Brian, thanks for joining today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Charles, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, thanks. So, Brian, would you mind giving a brief introduction to the audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Brian Sachetta, author and owner of Get Out of Your Head. Some of this will be repeated, but Get Out of Your Head is a blog, brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. So I like to say I'm just a dude, right? It's like I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, anything like that. I don't have medical credentials, but what I do have is life experience with mental illness. And I bring that to the table in hopes of providing like solidarity to folks and just saying like, hey, I'm here with you. These are some of the things I've been through. I know a lot of them will resonate with you, or you've been through them as well. And let me use that experience to try to help navigate you through some of the difficult situations and emotions you face in your life.
And Brian, that is exactly why I was so interested in having you on the show. Even myself personally, right? I've been trying to help people a lot with fitness and weight loss. And I tell people all the time, like you, I'm not a self-help guru of any in any way, right? I'm a normal guy who's been through it. I have a lot of good experience now that I feel is valuable, and looking to find other people like that to help share their experiences to help others. So, Brian, one thing, if you could you tell the audience maybe just a takeaway or strategy for better dealing with anxiety?
Yeah, I think two things that are important to cover off the bat. I think the first one is to remember that our minds are not our friends, or at the very least, they're not always our friends, right? So I think especially, we were talking pre-show about what we do for our careers and just talking about how we're both in, tech roles. And I think for a lot of us, right, we get into jobs where there's critical thinking involved, where either software developers, accountants, lawyers, something like that, where we have to think through a lot of problems and solve them. And so as we grow up, we sometimes take that critical thinking approach to all the problems that we face in our lives. And one of them is anxiety, right? And we say, okay, if I can just think through all the fear that I'm feeling, if I can analyze and dissect this situation, then maybe I will not feel so bad. And what ends up happening there, at least, for me and a lot of the folks that I talk to, is that we end up getting in these spirals of rumination and overthinking and perpetuating the negative feelings that already exist in our minds and bodies. And so I think the first thing is just to remember that, as my brand says, it's not only a brand, it's also sort of a mantra. It's like, get out of your head. Try not to go down those spirals of overthinking, because just putting my hand up and saying I have some life experience there, it's like that usually doesn't lead to good places. I think the second thing to remember, or an important thing to say, for approaching anxiety in general, is just to, have compassion for yourself and understand that even though you will face a lot of difficult moments, things can get better, and they often do. And don't lose sight of that, because, it's really important in this long, it's almost, can be a marathon of a battle. So.
Brian, I think to your point, right, we all tend to get in our heads, and it sometimes is, I find that myself too. Our mind isn't our friend all the times. It can be a great ally, but a lot of times I feel like we are waging a daily battle with our own minds to see which direction we're going to go. And I think we need to be aware of it. So Brian, that's anxiety. I mean, it's similar. Would you some strategy or takeaway for my audience as it when it comes to depression, to deal with depression?
Yeah, depression, I think, for me, and it's different for everyone. I think depression is harder to deal with, right? Anxiety, and they're both beasts. I don't want to understate or overlook either one of them, but I think anxiety can be a little bit more of like moment to moment. It's like, okay, today I feel one way, tomorrow I feel slightly differently, or an event that's on the calendar passed, and so now I don't have the anxiety associated with it, something like that. Depression, right? It's like, especially if you're dealing with major depressive disorder, it can last a really long time. Those feelings can be so pervasive that not only do you already feel terrible, but then you kind of have this second layer of thinking that says, well, if I already feel really awful and I've felt this way for so long, what is the point of going on? What is the point of continuing to try to fight off these feelings? And I guess, kind of tangent there is like depression, I define as, a state of helplessness and hopelessness. And so it's like, if we already have some sort of feeling of hopelessness inside of us, and then because of that feeling, we become even more hopeless, we're again falling into this downward spiral that doesn't help us. So there's a lot of things that we can do to help ourselves feel less depressed, but at the same time, it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. I think an important thing to remember is that as we go along this journey, even if we're dealing with MDD or something like that, right, where we're depressed for a long time, there are little pockets of hope where we don't feel so bad, right? And I think it's important to focus on those things and then try to replicate them. So, for example, if we can recognize patterns of saying like, hey, I went to the gym yesterday and for those 40 minutes, I didn't feel so awful. Then it's trying to pick those pieces out and say, how do I replicate those good feelings? And then try to reverse that downward spiral into something more of an upward spiral, right? Because depression, even though it's a horribly pervasive and persistent state, it is still just a state, just like anxiety. And so it's like, we need to figure out what are the things that we can do to help move ourselves out of that state. That's a really important approach to have, because it allows us to then say, this is what serves me, this is what doesn't. I'm going to try to focus on the things that do serve me rather than the ones that don't.
Brian, that's interesting that you mentioned even the working out, right? Because I feel like when people, and we all go through it, like, not that I'm depressed, right? But if I'm not having a good day, right? You feel like the tendency sometimes is to just almost shut down and not really want to do anything. And it almost is, that's the worst thing you can do. And I always find that in days like that, I get up, I get moving, I start to do things, I do feel better, and it does add some clarity. So I think as far as people shutting down, it's a natural reaction. You want to shut down, but I feel like that will allow your mind to just start to run away with itself. You'll dwell more on things. So it's almost a matter of at least get moving and do something and try to notice those patterns. So I think that's really good advice that you give. As far as anxiety, especially today in today's day and age, what's in your experience, what are like some of the common reasons why people seem to suffer from anxiety?
Sure. I think I want to give a more simple answer. I could dive deep into evolutionary psychology, all that sort of stuff, and we can go there if you want. But I think in general, right, like we are animals or beings that we're really good at surviving, right? Our brains are always like, especially for an anxious person, our brains go on high alert when threats come into our world. And so one way or another, we look at a lot of the different things that come into, our schedule, our calendars, into our environment. We see those things as threats, maybe not necessarily like physical threats as though they could actually kill us, but things that are threatening to our status, threatening to our emotional life, our relationships, things of that nature. So if you look at the way that life is constructed today, right, it's like, okay, we all need to work for a living. So we either have to show up every day, and maybe we're in a stressful work environment, and that can be anxiety inducing. We might not have a job and we might need to go seek one out. And so going to job interviews, going through that entire process, that can be anxiety inducing as well. So just going down the line of all the different things that we need to do each day, there's a lot of reasons to be anxious. Also, there's reasons not to be, but, just answering the question of like, why do people get anxious? I guess going off to some of the other things going on in the world, right? Like COVID, geopolitical conflict, the economy. You think about all the uncertainty that exists out there. And we say to ourselves, like, okay, if I don't know how this is going to go, then I'm going to worry about it. Maybe we don't necessarily carry that thought process out consciously, but that's what happens subconsciously. And then the next thing you know, it's like, oh man, I just spent an hour thinking about Russia and Ukraine. And thinking is probably the wrong word. It's more like ruminating and being really fearful of it. So I guess, kind of rambling a little bit, but it's like all the uncertainty that exists in the world, that becomes the manifestation of our anxiety.
You mentioned one thing there, and I wanted to ask this. You mentioned about our subconscious. In your experience, at least from my perspective, and obviously, honestly, I'm flattered that you thought I may even understand the science. So thanks for that. I like to keep it simple. But when I think a little bit deeper about it, we talk about our subconscious. I feel like a lot of times our subconscious will have a lot to do with anxiety. Is there anything we can do where we can consciously ignore our subconscious?
Yeah, this is a interesting topic. I like to think of like the subconscious mind almost as like, let's talk about, we were talking about, exercising and whatnot. The subconscious mind is sort of like what we are presented to, what we are working with, or what we are given either as children or as adults. Like it's sort of this entity that exists that we don't really see, that we don't necessarily control or have full control over. So what we almost need to do is we need to implement a bunch of different strategies in our conscious minds that eventually sort of erode away at the negative patterns that the subconscious runs. So if you think about it in terms of like going to the gym, right? We say like, okay, I am overweight, out of shape, something like that. Our subconscious mind could be of the same nature where it's like, it's not in the shape that we want it to be. It's telling us scary things. It's ruminating over frustrations and anxieties, but it is what it is, right? That's where we stand in present time. So it's like, if we take the analogy of going to the gym, it's like, all right, I might not be in the shape that I want to be in, but I need to get myself there. So it's a matter of going to the gym, lifting weights, walking on the treadmill, doing squats, doing jumping jacks, things like that. I think the same concept sort of applies with the subconscious mind, where it's like we almost need to train it. We need to say, okay, I'm implementing these different strategies. I'm meditating, sitting with my thoughts, and sort of telling my subconscious mind in various different ways that it's okay to not think about certain things, to calm it down, right? To almost, there's an analogy in the psychology world of like being the rider on an elephant. And it's like, we can't necessarily control the elephant, but what we can do is we can become better riders and teach it to go where we want it to. So meditation is just one of those ways that we can do such a thing. I think the other thing too, right, is like, if we're nervous, what I find to be really helpful is like reciting a mantra. And it's almost like, so a mantra I would just say is like a short, empowering phrase, right? So one that I tend to use that I borrowed from Tony Robbins is, if you get in your head, you're dead. And it's like, if you just say that consciously, it means a little bit, you kind of understand it or whatever. But as soon as you start saying to yourself, like, if you get in your head, you're dead. If you get in your head, you're dead. If you get in your head, you're dead. You're almost rewriting the tracks of your subconscious mind and telling it like, hey, I can't do this rumination stuff today. And it is a long process, right? It's not like we're going to change our subconscious minds overnight. It takes a long time, but continually implementing these strategies helps us become a little bit more toned, a little bit more buff, right? In the psychological world. So I think, again, it is a marathon, but just continually coming back to these various strategies is really important.
Brian, thanks for that. It's funny because as you were saying that, I kind of do something like that on my own, and I didn't realize I was even doing it. But I did an episode about this before. Again, it was not broken down the way you just did, but I call it in other areas, I mentioned it as being our bitch voice, right? And I've gotten to a point as far as my kind of mantra when it comes to that voice in my head regarding a lot of things is, I've gotten to the point, I've gotten pretty good at it, is I basically tell it when it starts to talk to me, I F off. I'm not listening. I have to keep saying it. It keeps talking and I keep saying it, but it does help. So I think what you're saying is really true. And obviously, I think people will all have their own way of dealing with that, their own mantra, so to speak. But I think just getting something for you that works could be extremely helpful for people. So similar, what do you think some of these reasons are today as far as depression?
Yeah, this one I probably will dive in a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Just because in my second book, I have a chapter or a large section dedicated to this. So there are a bunch of studies out there that claim pretty well that, if not prove, that depression is a disease of modernity, right? And that basically just means that if you go back in time, hundreds of thousands of years, and say, how were our brains and bodies constructed through evolution? What did they need in order to thrive in the past? And then you zoom up to today and you say, well, we haven't actually evolved in like 150,000, 300,000 years, some large number of years, right? So what we needed back then to thrive probably isn't all that different from what we need today. And so if we go through those various things, right, it's like we need to get some exercise. We need to get some sunlight. We need to eat a good diet full of omega-3s. We need to have close relationships with, loved ones, peers, different folks that we come across in our community. We want some semblance of security, right? We don't want to necessarily have to think about war, plagues, all these different things that go on in the world that we see on the news on a daily basis. If we then analyze all those things and say, okay, do we have them? Or, what's the current state of the world, the average life in America? I think it's pretty easy to say or see that a lot of people are lacking all of those different things, right? It's like we eat the standard American diet. And excuse me, I'm going to have a truck behind me, so the audio might have a little background noise for a minute. We're eating the standard American diet full of processed foods. A bad ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s, a lot of processed fats and things of that nature. A lot of us work from home, which can be nice once in a while, but we're lacking that connection with folks, right? And also a lot of us, for one reason or another, we have to put money on the table, and that's totally fine. But we might work jobs that we don't find meaningful. We don't find engaging. We may be inside. We may not get that sunlight that we need every day. And so there's a lot of different factors in the world that play into, basically not allowing our bodies from an evolutionary perspective to get what we need in order to thrive. And then if we kind of break that down a little bit, it's like, if I don't have what I need, then I'm not going to be happy. I'm not going to be fulfilled, insert whatever word you want there. And I think maybe it's not necessarily easy to see how we become depressed, but I think it makes sense if you add up all the factors.
Yeah, Brian, I think you touched on so much there that, again, from my perspective, it all makes sense. And I never really thought about it from the perspective of depression and how it impacts us. A lot of what you said, I thought, a lot of what you're saying about the diet, doing all those things, to me, I think of it purely from a physical health standpoint. I think people ignore a lot of the basics in regards to how it impacts our mental health. So I like to be totally open on the podcast with people, and, happened to me once. I won't sit here and say that I'm a person who's, dealt with extreme anxiety or depression, but I will share with the audience that probably going back a year and a half, I had what now I know was a severe panic attack. I woke up in the morning and nothing worked. Brian, I was in my head. I was pacing from the second floor to the basement, and I literally went through this probably for 2 hours. And the thoughts going through my head and the way I felt, at that point, I had no way to cope with it. I did find what helped a little bit was literally sitting on my deck at 5:45 a.m. in the morning was probably what calmed me the most. But I know that people probably deal with that more frequently. Fortunately, it happened once. I'm aware now. I've never had it again, but I really was hoping today for this podcast for someone going through the throes of anxiety, a panic attack, right? What would you say are some ways that they could cope, maybe to help them at least? I'm not saying it'll make it go away totally, but maybe lessen it to the point where it's not so severe for that amount of time.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing that I want to touch upon, which is difficult, is like, for the average person that goes through their first panic attack, they don't know what it is. I know that was the case for me. My first panic attack, I'm on a date with a woman that I liked. And all of a sudden, like, my heart is racing. I'm freaking out. I have no idea what's going on. And I labeled it as like, I was nervous. But if it gets so severe, you'll see a lot of different stories and firsthand accounts of people saying, like, I thought I was having a heart attack. I couldn't breathe. I could barely see. And that's really common. I think the scary and the sad thing is that we just don't necessarily have like the public knowledge out there for everyone to understand what that is when it kind of comes on. I think also, even if there were more just education in general around mental health in the world, it's such a frightening thing when it comes on for the first time, that even if you're like, hey, I know what a panic attack is, you might know it consciously, but emotionally and subconsciously, like, to be like, hey, I actually feel like I'm dying right now. That's a really frightening thing to go through. So I think, to folks that are listening, like, if you've been through that, or if you worry about that in the future, it's important to note that, like, panic attacks aren't actually like life-threatening. They may really feel that way, but we want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that we're dying, because then we go again into a downward spiral and make the symptoms of our anxiety even worse. So I think that's an important thing to start with. And then I'd say the second part of my answer reflects upon my first book. So in Get Out of Your Head, I'll call it volume 1. The first half of the book is centered around basically these 10 steps that I give to folks to help them mitigate anxiety. So they're called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And like you mentioned, right, it's like, we might not necessarily implement different strategies and tactics and completely annihilate our anxiety, but what we're looking for is a way to manage it, a way to mitigate it. And so these steps can help us do that sort of thing. So what I like to do on these podcasts, I could go through all 10 if you wanted to. I mean, obviously that would take some time. I like to just go through a couple. So why don't we do this? Why don't I say them out loud, and then you tell me which ones we want to dive into a little bit further? Does that sound fair?
Sounds great. Thanks.
Oh, cool. All right. So step 1 is to breathe. Sounds really obvious, but there's a little bit of science behind that. Step 2, determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. Step 3, evaluate the potential outcomes of the situation in front of you and reconnect to the one that you want. Step 4, shift your focus to something positive. Step 5, recite a powerful mantra. Step 6, stop questioning yourself. Step 7, utilize an empowering way to feel good right now. Step 8, get back to the present moment. Step 9, remind yourself the worst part of anxiety is the waiting. So that could be waiting for some event to occur, waiting for our bodies to calm down a little bit. And then step 10, remember this too shall pass.
Wow. Be honest. I think so when it happened to me, I think one of the most important ones, and you mentioned there's some science behind it, and people probably think it's so easy. Let's talk about the breathing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think an important thing to start with is to say that when we go into an anxious state, our bodies are revved up, our fight or flight mechanisms activate. So there's, if we look at the divisions of our nervous system, we have the autonomic nervous system. That's the part that regulates things without us having to think about them, without us having to control them. In the autonomic nervous system, there's a few divisions. So the two that are most important are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. I like to think of them almost as like a mountain or like a triangle, where it's like the sympathetic nervous system revs us up and the parasympathetic nervous system brings us back down to calm. And so when we get anxious, when we get fearful, that sympathetic nervous system is fully activated. Our hearts are racing, blood is pumping, palms are sweating, everything like that. What we need to do is we need to somehow get our parasympathetic nervous systems to kick in and get us back to a calm state, right? And so how we do that, like scientifically, we do that through breathing, specifically by breathing out. So when we breathe in, we activate the sympathetic nervous system a tiny bit. So if you were to look at, like a heart rate monitor or something like that, when we breathe in, our heart rate goes up just a tiny bit. And when we breathe out, our heart rate goes back down. And so if we're looking at, if we're taking this knowledge and saying, okay, then how am I going to use my breathing to get to a tranquil state? We need to make sure that we're breathing all the way in and then all the way out nice and deeply. So that way we get that full parasympathetic activation on the way out. And I think the other thing too is just from like a non-scientific perspective, when we are focusing on something other than our fears, right? When we're saying, okay, I need to think about my breathing. I need to focus on deep breath in, deep breath out, that gives us something to, shift our focus onto something either more positive or more neutral and away from our fears to, again, help us avoid that downward spiral.
Yeah, and Brian, for just real quick, for those that may not be watching this visually and they're only listening to it, as you talk about the breathing, I was thinking of, just to make sure somebody doesn't, I feel like if you're not breathing properly, the way you just showed that we could visualize, you could almost maybe go the opposite direction and cause yourself to start to hyperventilate in a way, right? So is there maybe a count or something for the people listening as far as, count in maybe 1, 2, 3 in, 1, 2, 3 out, something like that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a great point that you bring up. Obviously, we don't want to hyperventilate. Make sure that the breath is extended, elongated. Also, we want to be breathing from our diaphragms, not our lungs, not our chests. And then, there's a pattern out there called box breathing where you can breathe in for a count of 4, hold it for 4, breathe out for a count of 4. I don't think you necessarily need to do that. I would just say find a rhythm that works for you and make sure to count for a little bit of time. It could be 3 seconds. It could be 6 seconds. You don't even need to pause on the, you don't need to hold the breath in if you don't want to. I think the important thing is just to give yourself some sort of framework that allows you to take the idea of breathing almost off of your mind, right? To be able to just say like, it only takes 1 or 2 cycles before you're like 1, 2, 3, 4 in, 1, 2, 3, 4 out, right? So I think just having those numbers, being able to count, again, that focus coming back in, that's really important for allowing us to get our minds off of whatever it is that's scaring us.
Brian, the other one I wanted to just ask you about, because it almost sounds counterintuitive to me. You mentioned about getting yourself back to the present. In my mind, I go, okay, but getting back in the throes of a panic attack, would getting back to the present, is that almost the present is the panic attack to me, right? When you say that, what are we really saying there? I just want to make sure the audience is clear on that, because at least in my mind, the present is, I want to get away from the present. I want to get to the future where this is gone.
Yeah, it's a great nuance that you bring up. It's super important. I think, yes, we could interpret the present as the pain that I'm experiencing right now. I think a synonym for the present is, or saying find presence, is to get out of our heads, right? To avoid the overthinking that we're doing. I think the other thing too is, in finding presence, we're trying to look around and say, okay, what is it that I can connect to right now that isn't my fear? Obviously, if we're going through a panic attack right now, those feelings are with us. But, the way that I usually talk about this is in saying that anxiety is future oriented fear, if that makes sense, right? So it's like when we are thinking about things that could happen a month from now, a week from now, yeah, we give ourselves panic and anxiety today, but we are off in the distance thinking about everything that could happen negatively in our lives. And so getting back to the present moment is my way of saying, forget about those things that could happen one day. They're not here right now. Yes, we do have these feelings that are inside of us, a panic attack, our heart is racing, our minds are racing as well. Sure, that is some sort of presence in and of itself, but I'm talking about more of the what ifs on the horizon. And so it's like, as we're going through these steps, maybe not every single one is going to alleviate our anxiety immediately. So with this one, I'm more thinking about those what ifs. And then, in integrating the rest of the steps, it's like, okay, I'm no longer thinking about what's going to happen next week at that job interview, but I'm still feeling fearful. So let me go back to step 1. Let me work on my breathing and, deal with the anxiety that I'm feeling presently, or the panic attack that is going on in my body right now. So, none of these steps are a cure-all, so to speak, but it's definitely important to talk about the nuances because, we had talked about before the show that, on my website, I say I'm a no BS kind of guy, right? I give it to you straight and I talk about everything that we need to talk about. If I were to sit here and say like, oh, well, all you have to do is get present, Charles. And you're like, but dude, like I'm freaking out right now. I'm having a panic attack right now. How is that not presence, right? It's like, I have to have an answer for that. And I need to give it to you in a way that's digestible and that makes sense. Otherwise I'm giving you BS, and that's not what I stand for. So.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for that. I'm really enjoying the whole way you're presenting this, because it's really enlightening me a lot, and I'm hoping it's going to do the same for the audience. So Brian, right now, if somebody listening to this, what would you say to somebody that right now is in the throes of depression?
Yeah, it's something that I talked about already earlier in the show. It's just a message of solidarity and saying like, hey, I'm here with you. I've been through this before. Things could get better. They probably will. So hold on to the hope that you have. I mean, we talked about depression being a disease of hopelessness and helplessness. And it's like, if we can feed into that hopelessness on our own by saying things are never going to change. Everything in the world looks hopeless, right? We can exacerbate how we're feeling. And so I think it's important just to remember to find the things that spark us up a little bit, to hold on to the hopeful things in life, because it's very easy to go into that downward spiral. So I would just say, yeah, remember that things will get better. It doesn't seem that way right now. And that's very obvious, right? Again, going back to the no BS thing. I'm not trying to sugarcoat things. I'm not trying to downplay things for folks. Like, depression sucks. It is brutal. But a lot of folks around the world have dealt with it. 1 in 5 will deal with depression over the course of their lives. And a lot of folks get through it. It might take time, a lot of different strategies, but I think you'll get through it as well.
Yeah, Brian, thank you. I think it's very important for anybody listening that may be going through depression. Like, it isn't hopeless. And I think, if anything, just try to remember that it isn't hopeless, regardless of how you feel, and do your best to look for that hope. And if need be, obviously try to talk to someone. Sometimes that even helps, not even if it's not a professional, just sometimes getting it out there may help, and somebody else may be able to help you see that there is hope. So Brian, in general, as far as, anxiety, again, maybe, and I think you touched on it some, but maybe some ways that people can just build lives that are less anxious.
Yeah, for sure. So I like to preface this answer by saying, like, or talking about my first book. So my first book, there's 2 parts to it. So part 1 is called Zooming In. We're looking at anxiety in the moment, right? We're already fearful. How do we back ourselves out of that? Part 2 of that book I call Zooming Out, which is basically, how do we get ourselves into fewer of those anxiety provoking moments in general? One thing that we already touched upon a little bit that I like to discuss on podcasts in regards to, not having so much anxiety enter our lives in the first place is the concept of meditation. So I think a lot of folks that are listening are probably familiar with it, but it's basically just, sitting down by ourselves in a quiet room with our thoughts and allowing ourselves to see what's processing or going through our minds and not attached to it, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to not think, but all we're ever doing in our lives is thinking. So it can be really hard to turn that off. So what we want to do is we want to just say to ourselves, like, okay, I'm sitting down quietly with my thoughts. And look at this. Oh, I see that I'm now thinking about something that worries me, something off in the distance. Instead of attaching to it and fretting about it, I'm just going to let it go. And it's sort of like going back to our analogy of going to the gym and training our subconscious minds, right? It's this idea that we are rewriting the rules of what's happening subconsciously that we can't necessarily see. We're saying to our brains, hey, I don't necessarily need to deal with this stuff every time that it comes up. And if we're looking at, like, the avenues by which we arrive at anxiety, so much of it comes through our thinking. And it's almost like we need to give ourselves permission to drop some of the thoughts that pop into our minds. I like to say, we are not responsible for all the thoughts that arise from our subconsciouses. The problem is we feel like we are, or we feel like our subconsciouses are telling us something that we need to listen to, right? And as we sit with our anxiety or we sit with our thoughts in our meditation sessions and realize that, yes, thoughts are things, but they are only things. And once we detach from them and allow ourselves to move on without ruminating, without overthinking or analyzing a specific subject, we get better at that process overall. And that means less anxiety in general.
Yeah, Brian, I think you're definitely giving the people a lot to think about, and I think it's going to be very, very helpful, because if we're being honest, right, I think a lot of people suffer with this in silence, and they suffer alone. And just hoping that this podcast will at least let people know hear other people speak about this, know they're not alone, and know that, you can speak to people, you can do things to make it better. So Brian, I wanted to touch on this. What really, I'm being totally honest, what attracted me first and made me look into you and your site was your brand, right? It looks definitely wasn't what I was expecting. I saw this really cool logo and it made me start to look in and read about Brian. And obviously I was amazed, but again, your brand, considering your space, I would say your brand does look different. So could you tell us the story behind it?
Yeah, I do love talking about this one just because I am passionate about the brand. I would say a couple things. One is, my designer and I, when it came time to redesign the brand and think about what messages we wanted to put forth, we looked at the landscape and we said, a lot of the brands out there, and there's nothing wrong with it, but a lot of the brands out there are sort of in the like rainbows and unicorns sort of ethos or vibe. And that's wonderful, right? People do need, they need imagery that's uplifting and positive and whatnot. But he said to me, he's like, my designer, he was like, I've read your book. Like, you give it to people straight. It's sure, there's empathy in there. There definitely is. But like, you are not avoiding these heavy subjects that we need to talk about. You're a no BS guy. And so we started thinking about, again, the messages that we wanted to convey, what we wanted to put forth in the identity of the brand itself. And so we came across a bunch of different ideas, but this concept of the snake brain, which is the logo as it stands today. To me, what it represents is the idea. There's a few things. One is like the mind is a beast, right? Or it is a at the very least, it's a snake, and a snake coils, right? And can almost like kill its prey as it coils. So one of the ideas that we wanted to put out, obviously it's like subliminal messaging or like subtle messaging, was that our minds are like these beasts that we can tame and we can train. And so as we get better and better at training our subconscious minds, integrating all the different strategies that I put forth in my writing, we take that snake and we make it, I don't know, a little bit less threatening, a little bit more friendly, something like that. Another thing that I wanted to convey with the branding was, going back to that concept of not sugarcoating things, delivering a no BS kind of message, right? It's like, yeah, my branding, my logo, it's a little bit different. I don't think it's scary per se, but there's something about it that is, it's jumping out at you, right? And to me, what that represented was like, again, I am not going to sugarcoat stuff. Look, there are these difficult issues that we need to talk about, and we're going to talk about them. Like, that snake is right in your face. So that was really important to me as well. I also think just the sort of ruggedness, the rawness of it, like that emotion, that captures like, my approach to mental health in general, going again, the no BS approach, but also like just wanted to put a little bit of a fun spin on it. So like, I listen to a lot of heavy metal. That's a space that I'm passionate about. And, I've seen folks, I've heard folks see my logo and say, hey, it kind of looks like a, heavy metal band or like a minor league hockey team or something like that. So that was, again, another thing that we wanted to evoke in the branding itself. So it's unique. I think it serves its purpose and it's really interesting, but it depends, right? It's like, I will definitely have folks who come across it and they're looking for something calmer, less invasive or less, I guess, frightening off the bat. And so I might, somebody, it might not necessarily be for them, but that's what branding is supposed to be. It's supposed to say, hey, here's who we are without you having to know much about us. And if this doesn't seem like it's for you, then it probably isn't, right? You want to strike that balance, or you want to make sure that the outer image that you portray to the world matches the product and message that you're going to deliver. So I think we do that decently well. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a fan of it. So.
Yeah, Brian, I really loved it. And just going back to what I said a little bit ago about people when it comes to anxiety, depression, right? About suffering in silence, about hopelessness, things like that. Honestly, I think what your brand does to me, there's a lot of men and women out there, like, and I'll just say, right, they're badass men and women who feel ashamed that they can't cope with this on their own, right? So looking at your brand, your logo, what that tells me right away is it's like, you know what? It makes me go, that empowers me or empowers a person to say, you know what? I am badass. and I can start to tame this. And I think right away it starts to take away, it takes you away from a position of helplessness and hopelessness, and it starts to return the balance of power to you. So I think you guys did a great job. And I'll just tell you now, your logo, and people have already seen it because I have it already sitting here on the podcast. So
awesome. Yeah. Thank you. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I love to hear people's different perspectives, right? I lose sight of all the different messaging, but that's definitely in my head somewhere. It's right. It's like, I want this thing to fire you up a little bit. I'm not trying to say that anxiety is easy to overcome. I'm not trying to say depression is easy to overcome. But as you alluded to, it's like when we are down in the dumps, when we feel so awful, it's like we need a little bit of a spark, right? And maybe my brand, maybe the identity can help somebody say to themselves, like let's go, right? Again, I don't want to trivialize things in saying that it's, these are difficult issues that we're dealing with, but sometimes that is what it takes.
Yeah, definitely. It lets people know that ultimately there's a fighter in there somewhere. And, it just depends to what level. And sometimes it needs some help to come out. So, Brian, I want to kind of end with this. When it comes to your experience, your writings, things like that, could you maybe share what one of your more profound experiences dealing with mental illness?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ones that I could cover. So I got to kind of spin the wheels here for a second and just think about which one makes sense. I will kind of give myself some time and say the way that I approach my writing, if you've read one of my books before, if somebody were to read one of my books, it's this combination of personal stories and then science that either backs up the stories or tries to prove some sort of point related to, dealing with mental illness. And so I'd like to, the reason that I write that way, there's a bunch of different reasons, but it's like, one, I'm trying to make sense of the things that I've been through. Two, I'm trying to be relatable to the reader. I think that, I've read a ton of different books in the space, and don't get me wrong. Like if a doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist writes a book on mental health, like, sure, there's invaluable insights in there, and I might take them away and be like, hey, that was great. But sometimes they're missing that engagement, right? So bringing those stories in and saying like, hey, here's something that I've dealt with before. People love stories, and also being able to see themselves in a story. I think that's really important. One of the stories that I don't talk a ton about, but is in my first book, was this experience. I was on vacation with my family. This was 2018. And obviously, being the writer that I am, and being the writer in the mental health space that I am, and giving this honest approach, like I deal with anxiety, I deal with depression. That's the reason behind me writing both of my first two books. But so I'm on vacation with my family in Hawaii. I come back from the gym. My dad is like, hey, did you see that notification on your phone? And I didn't bring my phone to the gym. I don't know. I think I had music on my watch and I just wanted to zone out or whatever. And I was like, no, Dad, what was it? I was like, it was in January, the NFL playoffs are going on. I was like, did Brady get hurt or something like that? He's like, no, I was like, something about a bomb. And I'm like, a bomb, dude, what are you talking about? And I actually had turned off these Amber Alerts and things like that on your phone, where it's like if you have it on vibrate, the phone starts going nuts. You can hear it's like this unsettling noise. So I just, in the past I had turned those off, like flash flood warnings and things like that. So I was like, I don't even have it on my phone. So I go on to Google and I was like, Hawaii bomb threat or something like that. And then my dad gets his phone and he shows me what he saw, and I'm seeing all this stuff on Twitter. And it shows this banner that everybody was receiving on their cell phones. And it says incoming ballistic missile to the island of Hawaii. This is not a joke. Everybody take cover. And this was one of those life-altering moments where I will be totally honest. I was like, we are dead. Within 10 minutes, we're getting nuked and blown off the face of the earth. And it was a really, really unsettling experience. In the end, thank God, luckily, somebody made a mistake. It was a false alarm. There was not actually a bomb coming for us. But even though a bomb didn't come, we didn't get blown up, nothing got destroyed, it was still a really life-altering experience where it was almost one of those A Christmas Carol with Charles Dickens, not Scrooge. Yeah, Scrooge, where it served to wake me up. It served to say, okay, look, man, like if this is how you were to go out today, is this how you would want it to be? And so it really kind of got me thinking again, reprioritizing things in my life. This was before I had published my first book. And I said to myself, like, okay, man, like I'm not where I want to be. I've let anxiety take the reins at different points in my life. I've let depression take the reins at different points in my life. If I'm going to get to another moment like this, it might not be a bomb. It might be something else down the course of my life. But like, I will eventually, we all perish. Unfortunately, it's like at some point in my life, I will probably face another moment similar to this. Do I want to arrive at that moment with full regret? No, I don't. I also stepped back and I said to myself, like, I've let my anxiety get in the way of me building the life that I've wanted to over the course of time. I now realize, given the significant nature of this moment, of this threat that we faced, it was like, don't get me wrong. Anxiety is still very difficult to deal with. It's still very painful. But in the grand scheme of things, when you say, hey, I'm about to die, does anxiety feel so bad anymore, right? Does it seem like losing a job or, missing out on an opportunity, getting rejected by a potential mate or something like that? Does that seem the same as potentially getting blown off the face of the earth? Again, still difficult, but to me, it was like, it's not the same. And I want to use this perspective to say to myself, like, I need to go out. I need to use this as a reminder to go build the life that I want to. And that really pushed me into getting that first book done and being like, again, I want to build the life that I've been after all this time, but I've let my anxiety get in the way of. So that pushed me through, being able to take all those different actions that I needed to. And, I think it was anxiety was half of that battle. Half of it was just like, wow, how massive and how scary that situation is in general. So there are definitely other stories that I weave into my writings that feature a little bit more anxiety. But I mean, man, those 10 to 15 minutes where we really thought that we were getting blown off the face of the earth. I mean, talk about anxiety. I don't know if it's ever been that bad.
Well, on that, yeah, I mean, obviously glad that it didn't happen for everyone, but also it does, you really kind of sum it up there and put it all in the perspective to people about not letting anxiety, prevent you from making your life what you want it to be and what you deserve it to be. So I feel that was a really good way to end it, Brian. So thank you for that. I appreciate you doing this. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And I just want to tell people, please check out Brian's writings, his books, and just check out his website, www.getoutofyourhead.com. And a lot of great stuff up there. Really cool site. And people like Brian are out there. Seek them out because they will help you. So Brian, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I appreciate you having me on. Great conversation. I hope that it's helpful for some folks. So yeah, really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely, Brian. I'll tell you this. I'll leave you with this. I definitely learned a lot today. So thank you for that. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Take care and have a good day.
This has been the Bare Essentials. Thanks for listening. And remember, never hibernate on your goals.